The courtroom buzzed like a hive of restless bees, tension crackling in the air. The rows of benches were packed shoulder to shoulder with spectators, their eyes flicking toward the defendant's table. Whispers rustled through the crowd, each rumor more scandalous than the last. The tension escalated when he walked in, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a charcoal gray designer suit. The man carried himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. His slicked back hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and he smirked at the crowd as if they had gathered to admire him, not judge him. Ethan Grayson, a name that had dominated headlines for weeks, looked more like a guest of honor than a defendant accused of stealing millions from struggling families. His entrance was met with a mix of disdain and incredulity, but it was nothing compared to the moment when Judge Kofi entered the courtroom. Dressed in her black robe, Judge Kofi moved with quiet authority as she approached the bench. She didn't need to raise her voice or glance at the crowd to command respect. Her presence was enough. Her reputation as a no-nonsense judge who valued justice above all else preceded her. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Kofi," the bailiff announced. Everyone rose, everyone except Ethan Grayson. The room fell silent as all eyes shifted to the defendant. Ethan remained seated, casually flipping through a legal pad as if the proceedings were a trivial inconvenience. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Ethan waved him off dismissively. Judge Kofi paused at her bench, her gaze piercing. The silence grew heavy with tension and disbelief as murmurs rippled through the crowd. Who did he think he was? But Ethan didn't flinch. His expression was smug, almost daring the judge to react. "You may be seated," Judge Kofi finally said, her voice calm but firm. She didn't address the slight, not yet, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The tension was suffocating. Ethan Grayson was about to learn the hard way that even the wealthiest and most entitled are not above the law. He wasn't just any wealthy man. He was the kind of rich that made headlines. Luxury yachts, multi-million-dollar mansions on both coasts, private jets, and parties that could rival celebrity gatherings. His business empire, Grayson Investments, had once been touted as a beacon of financial success. But behind the glitz and glamour lay a darker truth. Grayson's rise to the top had been built on deception. He promised small business owners and middle-class families a chance to secure their futures. He'd convinced hundreds to invest their life savings in fraudulent schemes, retirement accounts, college funds, even entire family inheritances, gone in the blink of an eye. The fallout was devastating. Families lost their homes, parents struggled to feed their children, and elderly couples faced the terrifying prospect of living out their final years in poverty. The ripple effects of his greed spread far and wide. Yet to Ethan, it was just business. When investigators finally caught up to him, the evidence was staggering. Bank records, falsified documents, and testimony from former employees painted a damning picture. Yet even with the walls closing in, Ethan remained confident. "I've got the best lawyers money can buy," he told reporters outside his mansion in Malibu. "This will blow over." It always does. For a while it seemed he might be right. His legal team filed motion after motion, delaying the trial for months. They painted him as a misunderstood entrepreneur and a scapegoat for others' failures. But no amount of legal maneuvering could erase the mountain of evidence or the heartbreak of his victims. By the time the trial finally began in San Francisco, the courtroom was packed daily with people seeking justice, or at least some semblance of it. Among them was Angela Martinez, a widowed mother of 3 who had lost her home after investing with Grayson, and whose youngest daughter had been forced to drop out of college. Sitting beside her was Peter Vaughn, a retired firefighter who had spent decades saving for retirement, only to end up living in his brother's spare room. Their stories, along with countless others, were shared in gut-wrenching detail during the trial. Angela's voice broke as she recounted the day she realized she couldn't make the mortgage payment. "I begged them not to take the house," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But they didn't care. My kids had to sleep in our car for 2 weeks. Do you know what that feels like?" Peter's testimony was equally harrowing. "I spent 35 years running into burning buildings," he said, his voice heavy with anger. "And this man? He burned my future to the ground without a second thought. Through it all, However, Ethan sat there unbothered. He often leaned back in his chair, scrolling on his phone or whispering jokes to his attorney. For him, these were just irrelevant stories, noise that wouldn't change the outcome he believed was already in his favor. As the trial progressed, the press ate up the unfolding narrative. Headlines screamed of his arrogance, his lack of remorse, and the bold disrespect he showed the court. Public opinion was turning against him, but Ethan didn't care. To him, public opinion didn't write checks. Mr. Grayson deeply regrets any hardship caused, his attorney insisted during a press conference, but he remains confident that the truth will prevail. The truth, however, was that Ethan had no intention of admitting guilt. He was betting on the system bending in his favor, as it always had before. But there was one factor Ethan hadn't accounted for. Judge Kofi wasn't like the people he was used to dealing with. The trial was a spectacle. News vans lined the streets outside the courthouse, reporters jostling for position to capture every detail. Inside, the tension only grew as the days dragged on. Witness after witness took the stand, each one adding another nail to Ethan Grayson's metaphorical coffin. It was on the third day of the trial that tension peaked. The prosecution presented damning evidence. A series of emails in which Ethan explicitly instructed his team to falsify records and mislead investors. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor read his words aloud. Make the numbers look good. We need these suckers to sign on the dotted line. The words hung in the air like poison. Angela Martinez, sitting in the front row, shook her head in disbelief. Peter Vaughn clenched his fists, and Ethan, he smirked. Mr. Grayson, do you recognize this email? The prosecutor inquired, turning toward him. His lawyer jumped in before he could answer. Objection. This question has been asked and answered in pre-trial hearings. Judge Kofi raised a hand, her expression calm but firm. Overruled. The defendant will answer the question. Ethan leaned into the microphone, his tone dripping with condescension. Yes, I recognize it. But let's not pretend it means what you're implying. It's just business talk. You wouldn't understand. The crowd erupted in whispers, and the judge's gavel struck the air with the force of thunder. Order in the court. Judge Kofi commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. She turned her attention back to Ethan. Mr. Grayson, I advise you to watch your tone. This is not a boardroom meeting. Ethan didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed amused, as if this were all just an elaborate game. As the trial continued, his arrogance swelled. He interrupted witnesses with sarcastic chuckles, rolled his eyes during cross-examinations, and whispered loudly to his lawyer during key moments. The audience watched in disbelief as he treated the courtroom like his personal stage. Then came the day of Angela Martinez's testimony. She stepped up to the stand, clutching a folded piece of paper in trembling hands. Her voice shook as she began, but her words carried the weight of her pain. I trusted him, she said, looking directly at Ethan. I trusted him with everything I had, and he destroyed my family's future. Ethan didn't even look at her. He leaned back in his chair, casually scrolling through his phone. Your Honor, the prosecutor interrupted, pointing toward Ethan. The defendant is clearly not paying attention to the witness. All eyes turned to Judge Kofi. Her face was impassive, but her eyes burned with quiet fury. Mr. Grayson, she said, her voice measured. Put your phone away. Now. He glanced up, unfazed. I was just checking something important, he said, holding up the device as if to prove his point. The judge's tone hardened. I said now. For a moment, it seemed like he might argue. But then, reluctantly, he set the phone down. The tension in the room was palpable, but the damage was already done. Angela's testimony continued, her voice tremulous with disbelief as she couldn't fathom the lack of basic human decency displayed before her. By the end of her statement, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, except, of course, for Ethan. The prosecution rested its case a week later, leaving the defense to make their move. Ethan's lawyer tried everything, discrediting witnesses, twisting the narrative, even painting Ethan as a victim of overzealous prosecutors. But the cracks were too large to cover. Through it all, Judge Kofi maintained her composure. She rarely spoke, yet her presence loomed over the room like a steady, unwavering force. As the trial reached its final day, the air in the courtroom was electric. Anticipation hung heavily, almost unbearably. Reporters packed the back rows, their pens poised, cameras at the ready. The gallery was filled with victims, their faces a mix of anger and hope. All eyes were on Judge Kofi as she prepared to deliver the sentence. Ethan Grayson sat at the defense table, posture as relaxed as ever. He even had the audacity to flash a small grin to the cameras capturing his every move. He didn't look like a man about to face judgment. He looked like a man convinced he'd already won. When Judge Kofi finally spoke, the room fell silent. "Mr. Grayson," she began, her voice steady and deliberate, "you have been found guilty on all counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and the testimonies of your victims paint a clear picture of your actions. You manipulated, exploited, and destroyed the lives of countless people, all for personal gain." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but the facade was starting to crack. "Throughout this trial," Judge Kofi continued, "you have shown a blatant lack of remorse. Your behavior in this courtroom has been nothing short of disgraceful. You have insulted your victims, disregarded this court's authority, and treated these proceedings as if they were beneath you." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Angela Martinez, sitting in the front row, clasped her hands tightly. Her knuckles were white from the pressure. "Justice, Mr. Grayson, is not about wealth, power, or privilege. It is about accountability. And today, you will face the consequences of your actions." The room was so quiet you could hear the faint rustling of paper. Ethan's smirk faltered for the first time as he straightened in his chair. "Therefore," Judge Kofi declared, "I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Gasps erupted from the crowd. Ethan's face froze, the blood draining from his cheeks. 25 years. He had expected a slap on the wrist, maybe a few months in a cushy facility. But this was unheard of for someone of his stature. But Judge Kofi wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate liquidation of your assets to repay the victims of your crimes. Every dollar you stole will be returned to the families you devastated." The courtroom broke into stunned murmurs. Angela Martinez pressed her hands to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Peter Vaughn leaned back in his seat, his eyes wide with disbelief. Ethan shot up from his chair, his face red with anger. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice echoing in the room. "I'm Ethan Grayson. You can't treat me like some common criminal." "Mr. Grayson, sit down." Judge Kofi's gavel slammed down, her expression unyielding. Ethan persisted. "This is a joke. I'll appeal this. I'll have your career ruined, Judge." The bailiffs moved closer, ready to intervene. Judge Kofi remained calm, her voice cutting through his outburst like a knife. "This is my courtroom, Mr. Grayson, and you will show respect." Bailiffs escort the defendant out. As he was led away, Ethan continued to protest, his voice growing fainter with each step. The courtroom erupted into applause, something that rarely happened but felt entirely appropriate in this moment. Judge Kofi turned to the audience, her expression softening just slightly. "Justice has been served," she said. "Let this be a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." But as the courtroom emptied and the cameras outside began flashing, one question lingered in everyone's minds. Would this sentence be enough to truly change a man like Ethan Grayson? As the courtroom settled into silence, it became nearly empty, with only a few lingering reporters and victims gathering their belongings. The buzz of excitement still hung in the air, yet for those directly affected by Ethan Grayson's crimes, the emotions were complex. Angela Martinez stood by the courthouse steps, clutching her purse tightly. A reporter approached her with a microphone. "How do you feel after today's verdict?" Angela hesitated, her emotions tangled. "I feel relieved," she said finally. "But the truth is, no sentence will erase the damage he caused. My kids and I are still rebuilding, but at least now we have hope." Nearby, Peter Vaughn was speaking with a friend. "It's not just about the years he's getting," he said, shaking his head. "It's about the message. People like him think they're untouchable. Today proves they're not." Inside her chambers, Judge Kofi sat quietly, staring out the window at the commotion below. She didn't feel triumph or victory, just a steady resolve. Her role wasn't about personal satisfaction. It was about ensuring fairness and reminding everyone that the scales of justice could balance, even against the weight of wealth and privilege. Ethan Grayson's name would continue to make headlines for a while, but for the people he had wronged, a chapter was finally closing. The financial restitution would help many of them start over, but the scars he left behind would take longer to heal. As the weeks passed, the story sparked conversations across the country. It became a rallying cry for accountability, a push to hold those in power to the same standards as everyone else. People shared their own stories of injustice, drawing strength from the verdict. But perhaps the most powerful moment came from Angela's youngest daughter, Sophia, who wrote a letter to Judge Kofi that was later published in a local newspaper. "Thank you for standing up for my family," it read. "Thank you for showing us that people like Ethan Grayson can't get away with hurting people like us. You didn't just give us justice. You gave us a second chance." The saga of Ethan Grayson's trial transcended ordinary courtroom drama. It became a testament to the resilience of people, the importance of integrity, and the belief that justice can and should prevail, no matter the odds. So as you sit with this story, ask yourself, what does accountability mean to you? In your own life, how can you ensure that fairness and justice are not just ideals, but actions? Because in the end, justice isn't just the responsibility of the courts. It's something we all have to fight for every day.